You're very welcome.
I have to sit up front.
Are you the sanitary napkins?
Yeah.
This is
I didn't
sex
have-
talk. That's
I didn't have anything else. I didn't bring a pocket.
well, I just come and sit with you.
I can take a look at the book ahead of time.
Oh, yeah, well, oh.
I enjoyed the squirm count.
Comstock.
Somewhere, somebody done something like sex and social women, something about having a general hooker.
Just think if the internet had been around during the Civil War. If the internet were around, I could get over
Maybe they should say the unmaking of America. It is so amazing. Joan Rivers sort of once advertised, interviewed her many years ago. And her daughter was Linda. And the interviewer asked her, have you talked to her about sex?
Yes, well, that's what we're discussing.
And she said, sex? No, she said. All flustered? She said, oh, no, she's much too young for that. To have a mind. She was, the daughter, something like that. Oh. She said,
Yeah, I'll take there. Who does see
there
that?
she was. I'll control myself. It was very interesting. She has no faith. So, that's it.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
One side, anything there.
Yeah.
One side.
Yeah.
That's extremely Victorian.
They have a bigger turn rate. What else is going
It
on?
was so light. Because of the title.
Oh, that's tomorrow.
It's not
Oh,
very
that's true.
clear.
Oh, that's fine. I'll just have an app. That's
But
fine.
it's hard back.
No, I know. So you're left through the other books that they write. Well, they
Every time my book's mentioned around Brucey, he has a question at the end. Where, is it hardback? Like it's, yeah, like if it's paper.
After I got you from Fresno.
Yeah, you're right.
Apparently, I was in that lead in the front, all done up Victorian, I had a recital about that. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
How are you? Nice vlogs. What subject? History.
Yeah, we teach kind of answers.
Oh, okay.
Which one is
What,
And the dessert
Juniors as well.
was named
Barks
some
and then it
kind
was
of
something
nose.
else.
A lot of people like
They
sad.
well, had a dome and,
Just told me,
they
yeah.
really tried.
I used to like Dad's music. Real highly carbonated. And they had the brilliant plug and Dad's I think Pepsi took it over.
And they sell them, you don't think about it.
Yeah, you get an order from a place in Ohio.
You order from Amazon.
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's where Amazon gets it. Yeah. Take them a can if you want, I have plenty. Take them a can if you want, I have plenty.
Oh, I will, yeah. Yeah. He brought it up, but then I know girls had not. He said, yeah, we made
Born and raised.
I don't like these super huge
So yeah, I lived all over.
You know, we have a restaurant in
It's not at all surprising.
Oh, the Gordon's been around forever. Right. So it's only for
It's interesting. I went to
It's not Jake.
play there. My brother, my sister,
Yes.
so whether we wanted to.
That's quite awesome.
That's all that.
So what do they do for people from the other suburbs? As far as
some of them go out to tours.
That's better than
what's the membership? What's the total membership?
Ben Asher gave me this T-shirt that read, "Life is too short to drink champagne." I don't know if I would ever wear it.
No, I know.
But how many members?
35. 1 year.
So were you a member way back when they hasn't been about in
Women. Okay. But you know what?
I've never been here when there were so many empty seats.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Hamler. If I haven't had a chance to meet you before tonight, I'm the Chief Development Officer here at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And I bring regrets from our Edwin Wolf II director. Dr. Michael Barsanti is not able to join us here tonight. He had another engagement. So you have to deal with me. But I have the distinct pleasure to welcome you here this evening, and to also, if we could give her just a round of applause, I'll give her. You know, I'm a bit of the library company cheerleader. My husband, when I told him I was going to come and accept a position at the library company several years ago, he got a little bit of a chuckle out of that because I'm not a quiet individual to work in a library. And so, but I have to tell you, over the last 3 years, if I didn't love libraries before, I certainly love libraries now, because the Library Company of Philadelphia is one of the most phenomenal communities of scholars and community members who enjoy intellectual conversation, debate, understanding, community conversation. It is just a warm community that really looks to understand history so we can make the future a better place. And so I thank you for joining us this evening and being part of it. History really does make a difference in our future, and for us to understand where we come from so we can know how to create a better present-day society and really change what comes next, to me is amazing. And it's a pleasure and honor to share this evening with you. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Dr. Judith Giesberg, and I'm going to read a bit of her biography. If you don't already know Dr. Giesberg, she is a professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of History at Villanova University. She's the author of 5 books on the Civil War era. I'm going to read them for you so you can, you'll bear with me. Civil War Sisterhood, the United States Sanitary Commission, and Women's Politics in Transition. I think Carrie probably could tell us a little bit about it. She's nodding her head in the front.
I'm on my shelf. Yeah.
Army at Home, Women in the Civil War on the Northern Home Front. Keystone State in Crisis, Pennsylvania in the Civil War. Emily Davis's Civil War, the diaries of a free black woman in Philadelphia. And Sex in the Civil War, Soldiers, Pornography, and the Making of American Morality. She directs the project, Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery, which to me is a phenomenal project, and I can't wait to learn a little bit more about it. It's a project that digitizes information, information-wanted advertisements placed in newspapers by African Americans looking for family members lost in slavery. And so after people were torn apart and then they were able to find them, they went on search. And she's worked on that project for how many years now?
About a year and a half, almost 2 years, yeah.
So hopefully maybe that'll be another program we look at in the future. But without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Giesberg, and we'll talk a little bit more about upcoming events and other things later.
Great, thank you. You can hear me? Can people hear me? All right. I'm going to attach it now. So if you go through, is that where it's going to go now? All right, good. All right, I'm all attached. Good. That way I can move and I won't be, I'll still be able to be heard. All right, well thank you all for coming. I'm just gonna get the stuff set up here so that I didn't run that much. And make sure that my clicker here is working. Yep, it's working, good. All right, can everybody hear me all right?
Could you maybe move the mic up a little higher?
Sure. I actually have one attached,
Oh.
which is supposed to take care of that. But
Oh.
let me just play with the
Oh,
volume.
it sounds good now.
It sounds good now because I'm here. Is that what it is?
Well, if you weren't here, it wouldn't sound as good.
That's true. That's true. All right, let me just
Okay.
see if I turn this up a little bit. Can you hear me now? Is this okay? It's still better if I'm closer to this, right? Okay, I'll just stay over here. That's fine. That's all good. All right. Well, thank you again for coming. This topic is appropriate for this time of the year, perhaps, and I hope you'll find something enjoyable about it. This project, I'm a Civil War historian, and I study women's experiences in the Civil War, so this was a really different experience for me to talk about not real women, but women who arrive in military camps as paper women. Not real living and breathing women. But I do think that the story that I uncovered in this project is an important one because it tells us something about where we are today and the way we sort of link these periods of war and then these morality campaigns and follow them seems to be sort of a regular pattern. And I do think that something about understanding how this all began during the Civil War will help us at some point in time learn more about why this pattern occurs. So I'll just get started then and talk about what I found out. And if at any time I do stray too far from this, you'll remind me that I'm most audible when I'm close to this microphone here. So Colonel Ebenezer Pierce, picture here, had been commanding the 29th Massachusetts Regiment Massachusetts Volunteers really for only about 7 weeks when he suddenly found himself in trouble and in April of 1862 and was in the middle of court-martial proceedings. Defending himself from a number of charges, including conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Among the violations under this specific specification, which is a big specification, Pierce was charged with striking a private without cause, disguising himself and sneaking out of camp to keep company with disreputable women, and that's their quote, and reading aloud to privates in his company from a popular erotic book. Fanny Hill, or Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure by John Cleland, originally published in England in 1748 and never out of print since, features the story of a naive country girl lured into a life of prostitution when she moves to London. Fanny Hill is composed of a series of letters written by the protagonist to another woman, in which Fanny describes a wide range of sexual activities she engages in as a prostitute when she becomes a prostitute, including, among many other things, she talks about sex between women, cross-dressing, flagellation, orgies, public sex, the list goes on. Of course, period picture from Fanny Hill of flagellation, one of the many things she talks about in the book. When Private William McFarland, Pierce's former orderly, testified that he saw, and this is a quote from the court-martial proceedings, Colonel Pierce at 2 different times, once in the daytime and once at night, reading a book with body pictures in it, the JAG asked him how he knew the title of the book. McFarland responded that he saw it and that a lieutenant came in to borrow it while Pierce was out, and then found it on Colonel Pierce's desk. Pierce's own witnesses claim to have seen the book in various hands of officers and enlisted men, on the ledge of a tent, under another private's mattress, and alternately on top of Pierce's desk and in a drawer. Sometimes that drawer was open, sometimes that drawer was closed. Little wonder that one of the charges leveled against Pierce was that he had failed to competently drill his men. They seemed to be really preoccupied with exploring the sexual exploits of a female prostitute, maybe not so interested in drilling. The book seems to have been widely shared and borrowed among the men of the 29th Massachusetts. By the 1860s, Fanny Hill was advertised in the sporting press and was available with lavish color illustrations. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen is an image of one of the ways it was advertised in the mid-19th century. You can find these advertisements in just about every issue of the sporting press that was published widely in New York. And of course, because of advances to printing, the illustrations could be in color. And in fact, there are copies of Fanny Hill from the period in which images like this appear, obviously, in color. Here's one. Another one. There we go. 3 different witnesses described the images that they saw in the book. The court asked a James Booth, Colonel Pierce's current orderly, to describe the book in question. "It was a vulgar book," Booth replied. But when asked if he had ever read it, Booth said no. So the court pressed him on the issue, asking, "Well, how do you know it is a vulgar book if you've never read it?" To which Booth responded, "I saw the first picture in it." Digging for more specifics, the court asked, "Well, what kind?" To which Booth replied, "It was a woman with her legs open. She was all bare." Hoping to cast doubt on Booth, the court asked Booth, "Well, can you read?" To which the orderly answered, "Yes, sir." This last question underscored an important point about the erotica that circulated around US Army camps during the Civil War, and that is it could be enjoyed on multiple levels. You didn't have to read to enjoy the book. In fact, you could look at the images, or you could have it read to you. And just so you can get the full picture of what I'm talking about here, I actually brought a copy of Fanny Hill along, and I'll read just a couple sections for you. So you can just imagine. All right, remember, this is a woman's writing back and forth to another woman about what she's experiencing in London for the first time. "I was tall, yet not too tall of my age, which, as I before remarked, was barely turned of 15. My shape perfectly straight, thin-waisted, unlight and free, without owing any things to stays. My hair was a glossy auburn and as soft as silk, flowing down my neck in natural buckles, and did not a little set off the whiteness of a smooth skin. My face was rather too ruddy, though its features were delicate, and the shape was a roundish oval, except where a pit in my chin had far from a disagreeable effect. My eyes were as black as can be imagined, and rather languishing than sparkling, except on certain occasions when I have been told they struck fire fast enough. My teeth, which I ever carefully preserved, were small, even, and white. My bosom, you were waiting for that, right, weren't you? Was finely raised, and one might then discern rather than promise than the actual growth of the round, firm breast that in a little time made that promise good. Just one little sample. I'll give you one more. Or we could do more, but you probably get the picture after this. Next we took from, let me see, hold on. There we go. Next we took from the side of a room a long, broad bench, made easy to lie at length on by a soft cushion and a calico cover. And everything being now ready, he took his coat and waistcoat off. Stooping then to untie his garters, he gave them me for the use of tying him down to the legs of the bench, a circumstance no further necessary than as I suppose it made part of the humor of the thing, since he prescribed it to himself amongst the rest of the ceremonial. I led him then to the bench, and according to my cue, played at forcing him to lie down, which after some little show of reluctance for form's sake he submitted to, was straightway extended upon his belly on the bench with the pillow under his face. And as he thus tamely lay, I tied him slightly hand and foot to the legs of it, which done, his shirt remained trussed up over the small of his back. Seized now one of the rods, I stood over him, and according to his direction gave him in one breath 10 lashes, which with much goodwill and the utmost nerve and vigor of arm that I could put to them, so as to make him quiver against them. And it goes on, but I think you get the picture. All right. Of what Colonel Pierce might have been reading to his men that day, that he wound up in trouble and facing court-martial. So soldiers didn't have to read to sample the wide range of erotic images available to them. Some of them produced for the specific circumstances of the war. So not only books, but we have lots of evidence of images also being produced. There were many new printing and imaging technologies that made it possible for manufacturers to produce items designed specifically to appeal to men fighting in the war. One circular, and there was lots of complaints about these circulars that were widely circulated around in the camps, confiscated by Company E of the 84th Regiment Illinois Infantry in camp in Blue Springs, Tennessee, describes a number of images of suggestive scenes available to the men of the 84th way out in Tennessee. Titled, and here's a couple of examples of some of these circulars that were confiscated in camp that describe specific materials that were made available to men fighting in the Civil War. Titled New Pictures for Bachelors, I don't have that precise circular because it has disappeared from the collection where it once existed. But this circular, called New Pictures for Bachelors, the dealer who produced this circular describes or promises 12 by 15 inch images that he describes as highly colored and fit for framing for 12 cents a piece or a dozen for $1.20. Buyers interested in the discount could buy 12 of the same image if they wanted, or they could mix them up. If they were going to buy 12 of them, they were likely going to share them, I imagine. And I didn't actually have any of these images when I wrote the book, but since the book came out, a fine art dealer in Boston emailed me and sent me the images because he has them. So I have some of the images here for you that were described in this circular. This one is called Behind the Scene, described in a circular confiscated in Tennessee. This one here is called, and you probably can see this, A Bedroom Bombardment. The Wood Nymph's Frolic. Circession Slaves. And not pictured, The Maiden's Retreat, Jack and the Mermaids, Toilet Mysteries, Girls Bathing, and my personal favorite, Storming the Enemy's Breastworks. Which I do have now, actually. Somebody just emailed me and said, I have Storming the Enemy's Breastworks, so I might actually have a full complement of these by the time people are no longer interested in this topic. This last title, Storming the Enemy's Breastworks, which I don't have yet, might have had special appeal to men in the third year of the Civil War. The short description in the circular of the print promises that the picture featured, quote, an amorous Union soldier playing with the Secesh maiden, making a very indelicate assault, which the unsuspecting girl tried half-heartedly to ward off. Quote, under the circumstances, the description teased on, we must conclude that the breastworks unconditionally surrendered. Which is all to say, perhaps totally unsurprisingly, that erotic materials were widely available and freely shared in the US Civil War. And perhaps also, totally unsurprisingly, the Army was pretty nearly wholly unconcerned about this fact. Pierce was in trouble because he was a bad officer. Reading Fanny Hill did not make him a bad officer. Although he was found guilty of conduct unbecoming, at the last minute his command was restored to him. Beyond the US Army, though, there was concern. And this concern resulted in a little known and as yet unexplored piece of legislation. Passed in February of 1865 and entitled An Act Related to the Postal Laws, the law aimed to protect soldiers from pornographic materials. In Senate debate, one congressman insisted that the US Postal Service had become, as he described it, the vehicle for the conveyance of great numbers and quantities of obscene books and pictures, which are sent to the Army and sent here and there and everywhere, and that is getting to be a great evil. Indeed, court-martial proceedings and other records suggest that there was a good deal of porn available in the US Army caps. Senators did not qualify the terms used in the prohibition measure further. Like the old adage, I know it when I see it, lawmakers evinced a comfortable familiarity with what constituted pornography, and all of them accepted that it was hurting the war effort. The law provided for a fine of $500 to be levied against any person who mailed an obscene book, as they described it, pamphlet, picture, print, or other publication. The wartime measure set an important precedent for the more sweeping legislation that was passed in the post-war years. A federal law and a cluster of strict state measures known as the Comstock law. Comstock laws, if you take the federal measure and all the state measures. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, know about that, but for those who don't, these laws were framed by the intention to keep the US mail clean of obscene materials. These Comstock laws outlawed a wide variety of sexual expression and behaviors. And they resulted in the arrest of birth control providers and abortion providers, women who patronized them, and later in the century, those Comstock laws were also used to help criminalize homosexuality. These prohibitions stayed in place until the second half of the 20th century. We lived with those Comstock laws for many, many years. But wait, what? How did this whole thing happen? How did a congressional measure intended to protect soldiers and to secure victory in the battlefield become a vehicle for an expansive effort to take control of women's reproduction, among other forms of sexual expression? What connects this Civil War story that I'm telling you now with the battle waged 100 years later by lawyers, some of them involved in feminism, that resulted in the landmark decision known as Roe versus Wade? How did an effort to restrain men's sexual imagination birth an effort that controlled women's sexuality, to name just one constituency? In the book, Sex in the Civil War, I answer a lot of these questions. To begin with, I explore soldiers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about those answers now. To begin with, I explore soldiers' expanded access to these items and their interactions with obscene materials in an effort to understand the sexual culture of the camps. What meaning did they make of these materials versus the senators? Sex, of course, was part of how Civil War soldiers defined themselves as men. Even so, those of us who study this period have tended only to look for it in the narrowest possible terms. And this is when women were in the picture. But women, of course, entered the camp as pictures. And so too did men experience sex around, and surely even with, other men. The voyeurism and objectification of Civil War pornography helped create a fraternity among the officers and men in the ranks of the US Army. Exchanging and sharing these erotic words and these images formed part of a sexual culture of the camps in which officers and enlisted men implicitly agreed to ways of seeing women and also to ways of seeing each other and watching each other. Pornography, it could be said, could help make good soldiers. It allowed men to build fraternal bonds across rank and region. To understand the sexual culture of the camps, we have to remember the unique ways in which mid-19th century Americans expressed themselves, and the affective worlds in which they came of age. Expressions of emotional intimacy are a common feature of Victorian correspondence, for those of you who've read letters written by people living in this period. Authors regularly sign their letters with affectionate closing remarks, oftentimes yours affectionately, for instance. The feelings behind these expressions are captured also in photographs which were taken during the war, in which men pose unselfconsciously together, arms absently draped around one another. Among antebellum Americans, feelings of affection expressed in words, images, or touches could reaffirm period notions of manliness and fraternal love. And within the context of the war's violence, they could work in opposition to and triumph over the death that men witnessed every day. Understanding this helps us to get inside that sexual culture of the camp and to understand the context in which naughty carte de visite, those are the small card size images that people reproduced, and erotic books like Fanny Hill were both examined and shared. This is the first story that I tell in the book. It's a story of men consuming commercially produced erotic materials that, if not really new, these items, they were made newly and conveniently available because of the circumstances, the unique circumstances of the Civil War. These included cheap printing technologies, accelerated mail delivery, and of course, a concentration of men in military camps that were, in a sense, really mobile cities made up of large numbers of soldiers, and also the civilians and all the material they needed. Timing, too, is also important. In the decades before the war, officials in the United States and France and Great Britain made the very first efforts to control the trade in illicit materials. Convinced that the stuff was foreign, indeed the adjective French was attached to items thought to be illicit, French playing cards, French carte de visite, French condoms, of course. US lawmakers in 1842 tried to combat porn by amending the customs law to prohibit the importation of these erotic materials. This is 1842. Later, in response to similar efforts that happened in Great Britain and France, American lawmakers then strengthened that same customs law. Completing the perfect porn storm, if you will, the word pornography appears for the first time in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1842, again, as one of a number of, as they describe it, lower classes of art. And then in 1857, pornography appears again with a new definition in the Oxford English Dictionary, this time a description. It refers to a description of prostitutes or of prostitution. By the time tens of thousands of young men and boys left their homes and congregated in the mobile cities that made up the US Army during the Civil War, pornography was everywhere. It was produced domestically, printed and sold cheaply, and widely and easily distributed. In fact, one of the main impetuses for the birth of domestically produced pornography were these customs laws. Once they outlawed the importation of the stuff, it didn't go away. It simply then became produced domestically. And actually, it was the same stuff, right? There's no copyright on any of this stuff, so they just simply reprinted it under in New York and other urban areas. During the war, a number of new photographic technologies were perfected, broadening access to these erotic materials and allowing users to experience the stuff in a variety of forms. In this image from Harper's Weekly, which is titled Peep Show, again, you probably could have guessed that. Men line up in a camp in Virginia to view images through a stereograph. This innovation featured twinned images. Remember your viewfinders? Maybe. I'm old. You probably, some of you might remember viewfinders. Okay, yeah. This innovation featured twinned images that, when viewed through the eyepiece, as these men are waiting to do, and one man is doing, when you look through the eyepiece, it gave the viewers the impression of being in the scene. Here's an example of such a naughty stereograph. Which at the bottom there says, "How high is this?" You're supposed to imagine how high her skirt's up pretty high. This is 19th century terms here. It's pretty naughty. This is an example of a stereograph, maybe an example of something that these men were looking at in camp in Virginia. Even more discreet, so this is one of these new technologies available and widely used during the period. Even more discreet than these stereographs were these small beads called stanhopes. Stanhopes were miniaturized images embedded in beads that you could then install in the handle of your cane, walking stick, a pistol. You could put those stanhopes in anything that you just happen to be carrying around. I suppose you could even put it in a ring if you wanted to. And then all you needed to do is hold the little stanhope up to the light, look through it, and again, the beaded technology made the image look bigger, so then you could see then what was inside of it. This is one example of the stanhope, and here's a whole collection of them at the Kinsey Library in Indiana, where you can, where they have the best collection of all things that were prohibited by the Comstock law. They set it as their goal to collect everything that people were afraid of getting arrested for. So this is a pretty good collection of these stanhopes. Also newly available in the mid-19th century and widely circulated. And of course you could, owners of these could enjoy them anywhere, discreetly, without being detected. US soldiers, of course, were highly literate and apparently voracious readers, slightly younger than their Confederate counterparts and less likely, statistically speaking, to be married with children. Union soldiers were more often sons than fathers, or at least that's the way that congressmen talked about them. They talked about them as sons rather than fathers or husbands. Indeed, this in part explains the concern that arose among civilians about what kind of men they were becoming. Sharing pornography with his men and otherwise flouting the behavioral expectations of men with his rank, Colonel Pierce, pictured again here, was not only a bad Army officer, he was a really bad role model. Second Lieutenant James Graham of the 80th Ohio, I don't have his picture, but he was a good soldier. Graham enlisted as a private, and he mustered out 4 years later as a first lieutenant. Received nothing but praise from his fellow soldiers and was remembered fondly by them. He served under Grant's command in the Western Theater, first in Tennessee and then in Mississippi, seeing and enduring the kind of hard fighting that by that time had not yet come east. Through it all, he kept a diary. Advancing on Vicksburg in March of 1863, first on Union gunboats and then on foot, Graham chafed at the grueling pace of the campaign, and he hoped that it would soon slow down. The 21-year-old snatched slivers of time to himself nonetheless between the demands of an active campaign and nightly reveries that included whiskey, card playing, and pranks, all of which he records in his glorious diary. Graham consumed books as heartily as he did whiskey, and he kept track of both in his diary. In a March 6, 1863 entry, for instance, he tried to count how many glasses of ale and whiskey he had drunk before he was unable to find his tent. On March 16th, before playing something called whiskey poker, which I wish I knew the rules to, and pranking his fellow officers, he read The Orphan Princess, which disappointed him for a lack of a plot. Nothing doing today, Graham recorded on March 29th, so he finished reading another book. On May 3rd, after marching all day, Graham noted that he, quote, came across part of a book today, the whole of which I like to get, entitled Caroline of Brunswick. Closing in on the enemy in retreat, he hoped for some time to rest and to read it. While awaiting orders early the next morning, Graham read the book, discovering in it, quote, some of the most beautiful descriptions of sensual passion and amorous persons that I have ever read. Ah, what a pity that the writer had not devoted his descriptive and imaginative powers to something more worthy of his or her talent, Graham noted. But he finished the book nonetheless. Graham was likely referring to a book called The Murdered Queen, or Caroline of Brunswick, a diary of the court of George IV by a lady of rank, that's the full title, published in 1838. It's a secret history of the tragic marriage of the Princess of Wales, who was denied ascension to the crown for her adultery, kind of an 18th century Princess Diana story, if you will, told from Caroline's perspective. Like Fanny Hill, the murdered queen that Graham enjoyed that early morning, waiting orders outside of Vicksburg, was made up of a series of letters exchanged between the princess and a female confidant, in which the former revealed her dreams and stories of seduction, intrigue, and of course, murder. Lieutenant Graham's taste for whiskey and his preference for reading lurid tales about the interior worlds of European princesses seems really not to have concerned his superiors, nor did it interfere with his military advancement. Key to Graham's success was his performance in battle, including, of course, the long and grueling siege of Vicksburg. Grant's army won a key victory in mid-May after having marched some 180 miles and inflicting some 7,200 casualties on the Confederates. During that time, young James Graham seized moments here and there to read, by my count, 3 different novels. Graham and the other members of the 80th Ohio fought at Jackson on May 14th and then regrouped outside of Vicksburg, where, according to another veteran, for 47 days and nights it was constantly under fire from the town's Confederate defenders. The July 4th surrender of Vicksburg was a critical victory for the Union war aims, but the spring campaign had been very costly. Confederates counted some 20,000 men killed and wounded, and the Union reported nearly 11,000. That the young man was able to retain his interest in reading fiction speaks to his considerable fortitude. Neither his commanding officers nor his men begrudged James Graham his scant leisure time, whether he spent it in drinking whiskey, pulling pranks, or reading books about, as he liked to call them, amorous persons. Graham avidly participated in camp culture, drinking when he wanted to and reading whatever he could get his hands on, particularly erotic literature. Tennessee and then Mississippi were about as far from New York erotica dealers as a man could get, yet Graham found erotica here and there. He picked it up from his comrades, sometimes he picked it up from the rubble and detritus left from the army, that the army had left behind. One of the 2 armies had left behind. It might not be an exaggeration to say that the war made possible that transfer of that pornography, a triumph, if you will, of that pornography that he enjoyed. The other story that I tell is the story about reaction to that materials. Reaction to not to the war's violence, mind you, that I also just described, but to the sexual culture that the war made possible. This concern manifested itself in that February 1865 measure that I told you about at the beginning, which was tucked inauspiciously into an omnibus post office bill that outlawed the mailing of obscene materials to men serving in the U.S. Army. Remember, again, senators were worried in February of 1865 they might lose the war because men were reading too much porn. This wartime measure, it turns out, had no teeth, for although the trade in obscene materials remained brisk, only a handful of people were ever charged with violating that law. But it was the germ of an idea that would come fully into fruition within just a few years of the war's end. Anti-pornography germinated within the ranks of a group of New York reformers who first began the Young Men's Christian Association, or the YMCA, and then its mobile wartime unit known as the United States Christian Commission. The germ of anti-pornography found its most hospitable host at last in the heart and the mind of one particular U.S. Army recruit, Anthony Comstock, Private 17th Connecticut Volunteers. And the key to understanding post-war anti-pornography is in exploring Comstock's time in the Army. Comstock's experience in the war did not compare to Pierce's or to Graham's, both who enlisted early and who saw some of the war's worst violence. Indeed, months after surviving his court-martial proceedings, Pierce, who I told you about at the beginning, his right arm was shot off by a cannonball. Pierce recovered and served for 2 more years. Anthony Comstock enlisted very late in the war, when the hardened 17th Connecticut was really reduced to serving only as a sedentary occupying force in St. Augustine, Florida. He saw no combat. His entire Army experience consisted of inspection and guard duty. Camp life left Comstock feeling alienated. And he struggled with feelings that he didn't understand. Among the fragments of Anthony Comstock's diary, there is scattered evidence of these struggles, including, not unexpectedly for a young man at this time only 20 years old, with his own sexual urges. On camp guard duty today, he recorded on a hot day in July, very, very severely tempted and led almost into the lion's mouth. In another entry, again tempted and found wanting, sin, sin, oh, how much peace and happiness is sacrificed on thy altar, Comstock confessed, on a day when he had had more success. Seemed as though devil had full sway over me today, went right into temptation, and then Jesus snatched me out of the reach. Other days, sin or Satan won. As on the day he wrote, oh, I deplore my sinful, weak nature so much. If I could but live without sin, I should be the happiest soul living. What a day will it be when that roaring lion shall be bound and his wandering cease. When he was tempted by Satan, as he liked to say, he credited his victories to God and his failures to his own weakness. It's certainly not unusual for young men and women to use their diaries to keep track of their emotions and their feelings and their struggle to control them. Clearly that's what he was doing. But Comstock also did not get along with his U.S. Army comrades. Just a few weeks after mustering in, Comstock reported to his diary that he, quote, tried drilling good company for the first time and began studying a book of tactics. I resolved to know all that I can about military life while in the Army, Comstock reported a few weeks later, having decided to fill his free time by becoming a better soldier. Comstock's studying paid off. He noted when at inspection, an officer pronounced his gun the best cleaned among the privates in Company H. His early enthusiasm did not endear him to his comrades, no surprise. However, and by March, he reported that, quote, Charlie became offended at me and threatened to leave my tent because I worked so hard. You're probably thinking Frank Burns. Again, I'm dating myself here, from MASH. That's probably a good thing to be thinking about now. The seasoned men and the new arrivals among the 17th seem to have rather quickly sized up Anthony Comstock as an overeager green recruit. For a few days later, Anthony admitted that he, quote, heard some person speaking against me. Soon after his enlistment, he complained in his diary that men in his company used unpleasant words against him, and he noted a conflict with feelings with one of his fellow soldiers. Comstock's isolation was complete when he moved to his own quarters, only to return to his room to find, quote, all the windows closed tight, room full of smoke, bunk full of rubbish, and loaded with broken chairs, benches, etc. Although he dismissed the episode as an initiation, Comstock had been with the 17th for almost a year when his comrades dumped the trash on his bed. Military life confounded Anthony Comstock, and it left him feeling alone and isolated. It didn't help that Comstock refused to participate in the culture of the camp, or as he described it, join with them in sin and wickedness. It's no wonder that Comstock chose not to attend the reunion of the 17th in 1884, when the survivors dedicated this monument at Gettysburg. Anthony Comstock's brother's name is inscribed on the monument, for he died at that battle. Anthony contributed money, but he did not attend. Few of the regiment's veterans mention Anthony Comstock. His wartime service was forgotten by his contemporaries and overlooked by historians. In fact, I had no idea that Anthony Comstock had served in the Army, though I've known about Anthony Comstock for about as long as I've been studying history. Perhaps Comstock never forgot how isolated and out of place he felt among the men of the 17th. When he recalled his time in the Army many years later, he rewrote it to fit contemporary dangers. His Army comrades might have forgotten him, but by then, after more than 10 years of fighting porn, abortion, and birth control, Comstock's name was very well known. Anthony Comstock held the prominent position as special agent to the US Post Office, where he led the campaign against pornography and other items labeled obscene in state and federal law. From his home and his office in New York City, Comstock liked to share with anyone who would listen stories about his latest war, complete with a body count in which he kept track of men and women he had sent to jail, and those unfortunate ones, chiefly abortion providers, who actually committed suicide while they were completing their sentences. Anthony Comstock was still in the Army in his mind, fighting his own personal, well, no, not in his mind. He was still in the Army in 1865, fighting those personal demons when the US Congress passed that 1865 measure. But in the years after the war, he was looking around for something that could hold his interest and that he could be good at. So Comstock settled on porn, fighting it, that is, armed now with an 1872 federal law and corresponding state laws that marshaled the police powers of the state to control men's access to pornography. And now, thanks to late contributors to this campaign, women's access to birth control and abortion. Those were added to the 1872 measure. In effect, though, it really was the latter measure that was most effective, with the Comstock law criminalizing a number of women's traditional birth control strategies and incarcerating or threatening to do so those who dispense them, a product of the US Army military camp, those mobile cities of young men and the stuff they like to read, gaze at, and to share. Comstock mustered out of the Army with a sense that he had been one of the war's victims, injured not by the war's violence, but by the sexual culture of the camp. With Rambo-like conviction, like Rambo, Comstock launched a war that he could and he did win. But Comstock did not do this alone, nor would it have been possible without the endorsement of US lawmakers, the participation of local law enforcement and medical professionals, many of them also US Army veterans, by the way, and growing popular support. Also made possible, by the way, by the alliance, the late alliance of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which also was founded in 1872, and took an interest in prohibiting pornography. less of an interest in all the other stuff, but they certainly didn't want young children getting access to pornography. So they became interested, and they helped this measure actually have teeth. The anti-pornography measures passed late in the Civil War and those that passed afterward bequeathed an American legacy of post-war attempts to shore up the family and domesticity by attacking sexual practice, particularly, as this case suggests, women's. In our textbooks and the way we teach this period, we often label this period as a backlash, an attack on feminism or women who violated the norms of femininity. But I think there's more to be told than that. The term doesn't capture how war unsettles contemporary expectations for masculinity. How, in bringing men together, war reveals that manhood is highly variable and always contested. We may never know what so profoundly unsettled young Anthony Comstock about the men around him, about his own physical and emotional reactions to them, but we do know the legacy that he bequeathed us. I wonder if I can get past the Rambo. There he is. Good.
Yeah.
After wars, we pass laws that cover over these uncomfortable truths. Laws that seem to apply to women and men, but often fall heavier on women, also fall heavier, as this case suggested, on men who love other men. This is the story of pornography and the Civil War that I strive to tell in the book. One that I hope you'll read, and I hope that will get us thinking about how war settles a lot of questions. This war settles a lot of questions, for instance. It settled, of course, the big question about slavery. It settled the question about the status of the Union. But it left a lot of others unanswered. Among those was what makes a union and what makes that union moral. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions. Is that okay, Rachel? And I'll repeat them so they can be heard up here too. We'll start there and then we'll go to Carrie.
Were there pornographic or illustrations of homosexual acts, or was it all just women? The
photographs that I have seen are mostly of women. There are not a lot of men pictured in the photographs. The descriptions can be a lot of different things. They can be, like Fanny Hill had descriptions of women together with women. I have not found images that describe, that illustrate that.
And was Comstock married himself?
That's my question.
Good question. He was married later on. He after the war, he married, and this is the big elephant in the room is, can we figure out if Anthony Comstock was actually struggling with homosexual feelings, and that's what he was trying to fight, right? And if he had just, gotten over it and embraced them, then maybe he wouldn't have been such a jerk. Right? Is that, I didn't mean to read a lot of questions. That was probably more than you were thinking, but was I kind of close to where you were thinking?
Yeah.
Right. So I don't have any smoking gun for any of this stuff. We know that he marries later in life. He marries a woman who's some years his senior. They never have children. They do adopt a child later in life. And then, of course, there are all these, there's not a lot of Comstock's papers left. Even the diary that pages of it were reprinted in the early 20th century biography of him has disappeared. So it's not entirely clear where his personal papers have gone to. So we don't have a lot of information about him. We do know that he married late, and we do know he married this a woman much his senior, and apparently from the stories he liked to do housework, whatever that means. Who knows? But there is a really great dissertation done by a young scholar who, it's going to be a book soon, and that'll maybe help us figure out some of the answers to this question. He studies Anthony Comstock. One of Anthony Comstock, his main biographer in the 20th century is his father served in the United States Army in Anthony Comstock's regiment. No, sorry, another Connecticut regiment, not Anthony Comstock's. Another Connecticut regiment that was also in St. Augustine, Florida. And this biographer, the man who served in the other Connecticut regiment at the same time as Anthony Comstock, was having a same-sex love relationship with another man at the same time. If there could be any sort of 6 degrees of separation. Anthony Comstock was friends with this man in the Connecticut, in St. Augustine, and we do know that this man was having a same-sex relationship, and later on, so Comstock wasn't as lonely as it sounded like. He always talked about himself being so lonely. He wasn't. He had friends. One of them was this friend whose son then goes on to be one of Comstock's main biographer. His authorized biography is written by the son of this man, right? So there's all sorts of interesting connections there that really should have made Comstock sort of happier with his life in the army than maybe he was. So that was a really long answer to your question. Probably I could have just answered it with a yes. But anyway, yeah.
I wondered, being here in Philadelphia and the Centennial, if these forces to control morality were in evidence there, if Comstock himself might have taken the soapbox at the fair, or the Temperance Union must have been there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure that the Philadelphia chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was involved with the Centennial. I would be really surprised to know. Because
drinking fountains and such.
Right,
yes.
right. Yeah, because every voluntary organization, particularly those that were run by women, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was involved with the Centennial, so I'm quite sure they were involved.
I'll make this brief, but you're talking about the technological advances in the mid-19th century that made the distribution of materials like this easier. Did then materials that also came, Nickelodeon and all that afterwards, did that get painted a bit with the brush of sinfulness because of the pornography?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I think so. I don't know. Is Nickelodeon, is that moving pictures, right?
Yeah,
moving pictures.
Fox.
That's what I thought. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Ones.
Yeah,
yes.
that's what I thought.
Early motion pictures.
So in answer to your question, or the question, I'm supposed to be repeating the question, new photographic technologies that were invented after the Comstock Law, did they also get sort of tainted with the...
Or suspect.
Suspect with... let me answer that question in two different ways. I haven't sort of gone forward and studied technologies that were not available during this time,
right.
Except that every update of the Comstock Law keeps adding more technologies onto it.
Right.
Right. So by the 1880s, these local Comstock laws, the list gets longer and longer and longer. Right, and if they'd still been around, they would have probably added the internet, right? To their list of the ways in which pornography.
Technology always picks up on porn
right away. Absolutely, yeah. And then the second, so you just got my second answer.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that every new imaging, every new sort of image that was possible during the 19th century, the first generation was. The carte de visite, right?
Yeah.
Even the carte de visite, again, you know what those are, those small. They immediately had these sort of erotic versions of the carte de visite, also sort of exotic landscapes, Jerusalem or the Grand Canyon or something that you hadn't seen that were sort of exotic places to visit, and then of course women.
Yes.
Naked women.
Yes.
And at the Kinsey Library, it seems as if you can just sort of you can predict every new piece of the Stanhope, the stereograph. Right. The first thing they always did was produce erotica with them, or erotica dealers got a hold of them and used them to create erotica.
Demand.
Yeah. So I guess I think. The short answer to your question is yes, every new imaging technology becomes suspect, but probably with good reason, maybe because the stuff is always, right? There's always a demand, and there's always some proprietor who's willing to produce this stuff in new forms. Yeah. I think it was Avenue Q. Has anybody ever seen seen that show on Broadway? Avenue Q. It's like that song, "The Internet is for Porn," right? Isn't that a song from Avenue Q?
It's true, it made it.
It's true. Yeah, it is true. Right.
Videotape and all the rest
Right.
of it.
Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Carrie, Carrie, do you have a question?
I know, I was just tagging on what, my question was,
Yeah.
was he married? And it was right down that, the
Yes.
same way.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Was Fanny Hill an actual person or was it a pseudonym?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's a pseudonym, but I don't know the answer to this question. I'm going to have to look that up. I'm remembering that people have said they didn't that we don't know that this person ever existed.
Nobody knows where the little houses with the picket white fence and everything.
Sorry, say that again.
Nobody knows where the little houses where she was born with the little picket white.
Yeah, no, I think she's a composite kind of fantasy, right? That seems to never ever. I mean, that one I was reading is like 1990s version of it.
Yeah.
And I don't think they've actually changed. I'm sure they update it. You know, I was trying to get the authentic 19th century language, but the stuff doesn't change. You know, 50 Shades of Gray, right? 50 Shades of Blue and Gray. Somebody called this project when I first started it. Right? It was that same year. You're just writing 50 Shades of Blue and Gray. And, so I don't know. I didn't actually read. I need to read that. Maybe I need to read that book. Maybe I don't need to read that book. But maybe I don't.
For her.
Pardon?
Look what it did for her.
Yeah. That's what I should be writing, right? Yeah. Instead of being a historian, I don't think so.
It's actually part of an SVU episode.
Say that again?
The plot of an SVU episode is based on 50 Shades of Grey, and a professor writes a book.
Oh, is that
about a
right?
younger person. Yeah.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, Leo.
I'm almost afraid to ask, so
Sure.
feel free to not answer this.
Oh,
This is
sure.
important, yeah.
It's going to be a good question. I
But
can tell.
I think that I'm particularly interested in whether or not you've confronted with Foucault at all and his history of sexuality, and like in what, because I feel like you're saying some very different things, and it's really kind of exciting to hear that.
Yeah. Oh, well, I love it when graduate students bring up Foucault. It has to be a graduate student who brings up Foucault.
That's why I was afraid to ask the question.
No, I think I feel like this is it's like the comprehensive exams in reverse.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool, actually.
That's why I came.
It's been a really long time since I took my comprehensive exam, so. You know, I think you never really get far away from Foucault, and I'll keep this short for people who are like, well, who the hell is this Foucault guy? Why are we talking about him? But I do think there's a way in which that there's a new sort of that there's a new way of administering sexuality that is not yet that we're not quite there yet with these with this generation. That by the late 19th century, we then Foucault talks about how Freud really screws everything up, right? When Freud comes around, instead of our embracing our sexual selves, right? That that there's this sort of normalization of certain kinds of sexuality that then in effect casts every other kind of sexuality as abnormal, and this is, I think this is sort of anticipate, that we're here at we're here before this is happening. You can certainly see that in the ways that the Army deals with cases of homosexuality. They're not sort of administering this as they would, as a later Army would, right? There's a lot more sort of, I don't know about leeway, but there's less kind of a desire to label and to compartmentalize and to order sexuality in the way that you'll get in the early 20th century or later 19th century when Foucault talks about this sort of administration of sexuality is deployed. Right, so I'm not sure, did that
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that answered, okay. So this book project began as a series of lectures I gave at Penn State for a big audience. So I tried not to I tried not to drop a lot of Foucault on them, but this is Philadelphia, right? Right? We can drop some Foucault and people won't, right, turn their heads and run away. Thanks for that question. Whatever you got on your comps clearly was not high enough. Giving you something higher. Leo is a graduate of Harvard. Good question. Other questions? There was somebody over here. Just raise their hand. Yes, sir.
Did you or has anybody considered the role and the impact of camp followers on the Civil War?
I did not in this project, but there are others who looked at camp followers, the euphemism that people used for prostitutes during the Civil War. There have been other studies on prostitution during the Civil War and the attempts by the U.S. Army to regulate prostitution, even to license prostitutes in some cases. There are some studies of that.
I presume there were other outlets than looking at pictures.
Absolutely, of course, yeah, of course, right. And judging from how many times men in the Army were court-martialed for rape, they were not all they were not all sort of, you know, professional women that were objects of these men's desires. But there were clearly, you know, based on these episodes when we know there were armies that tried to control access to prostitutes and prostitution. We know that was certainly another part of the picture that I didn't really want to get into in this project, because I really wanted to think about what they were looking at and why senators were concerned about what they were looking at. They didn't actually, the senators actually never talk about that. They're not really, you know, they're just sort of pretending like that's not there, like they did at home in New York or Boston or Philadelphia. What they were mostly worried about is what they were carrying in their haversacks and what they were going to bring home with them. Yeah, yes?
So I have a question. When you were researching these men and their backgrounds, were any of them educated in the traditional, like, British system, like Hotchkiss or Lawrenceville, the boys' school?
Yeah, some of them, like, I think even Comstock probably went to schools like that. There were some of these schools that these guys would have attended, particularly in New England, might be comparable to those academies and those schools. Yeah. Others of them, it's not clear. I don't know enough about them to find out where they were educated, if they were educated in those kinds of schools, or, you know, something more rural and not comparable, multi-age, multi-gender. Right. But it's an interesting kind of thing to think about, right? That some of these behaviors are, or some of these things
manifested when they were teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you sort of think about the literature that comes out after World War I about sort of, you know, what was that all-boys school experience like for these young men, and how did they then, you know, on the Western Front sort of reproduce those kinds of experiences they had in school when they were together in the Army again. I think some of that is operating here too, and I don't know, I don't know enough about these guys. They're not writing about that experience as much as they would after World War I, or maybe they're not being encouraged to be that introspective about it.
I'm not that teenager. My brother was in the Pacific, you know, and I was a young kid, and when he came home, I went through all the suitcases to see whether he had any.
Oh, you did?
We used to sneak around to the sorority meetings and say, look at this, my brother. What's this for?
Yeah, they do. Some of these soldiers talk about how they would, they talk about how they get rid of stuff as they went into battle. Because the last thing they wanted to do was have anybody find French playing cards on them when they were killed in battle. And they thought a lot about that. They worried about what people would find.
Especially if your father's a local minister.
Yeah. Or your sister's waiting at home, your nosy sister's waiting at home to look at your stuff when it comes back. Yeah. And, you know, and the result of that is it's really hard to find this stuff, which is something else I talk about in the book, that there's mention, like this circular that was in the National Archives and now again has disappeared from the National Archives, but there's an image of it in a publication that was, an article that was published earlier in the 20th century. You can see the whole image of the circular, but it's gone. Sometimes some of the books that I looked at the Kinsey Library have, the images are gone. They've been ripped out. They've been torn out. So there's stuff isn't there.
Not even with a razor blade?
Yeah, well, or something, but it's not there. This stuff is, somebody referred to them as ghosts in the archive, because you can find descriptions of a lot of this stuff, but you can't find it. And when I was working on this project, I would go to archivists and, at the National Archives and ask those questions about, I'm looking for pornography, and they'd be like, well, you're in the wrong place. You don't have any here. That's not what we do here at the National Archives or the Library of Congress or whatever. Right? And they'd always give me, and a couple times, I think it was the Library of Congress, one archivist said, well, I think what you need to do is go to these trade shows where people are selling period photographs. And so I went to a massive photography kind of convention in New York, and I didn't, and it was a big mistake because I didn't know what I was doing, and the stuff is not labeled. Like as a historian, I need the stuff in a folder that tells me 1863, right? Or that gives me some paper trail that I can figure out who had the stuff, when was it produced, because otherwise I don't know. I can't tell. I can't look at a photograph and tell if it's a period print unless somebody says they're looking at it and they describe it for me and it has a date on it. So I didn't have a whole lot of luck finding the stuff. But then again, like I said, since the book has been published, these fine art dealers are calling me and saying, oh, I have that. And I thought, well, that's not a place historians usually go. Like I don't look at auction catalogs because I don't make that much money. So, and so I can't spend. I'm not a collector. I'm a historian. So it's not like I have institutions like the library company. And if they don't collect it, or if it's not there, then I couldn't find it. So I searched everywhere, and every little piece of information I could find I used. And then there's this great bibliophile, this person who publishes a list of all the banned books, and he keeps track of them. And that's really good because it was published in the 1870s, and that turned out to be a great source because every time I couldn't find something, I could go to this list of banned books and say, okay, well, here's at least a period description of what the book was about. Yeah, but it's hard to, I think it's still really hard to find it, or at least for a historian, it's hard to find it. I think other people might be able to find the stuff easier than me. It's not like it's not like on the period collection. Yeah, I don't shop eBay, which I wouldn't even know how to start to do that. I just, type in porn on eBay. I don't think that's what I want to do.
Don't do it on any Villanova.
No, I'm not doing it on any institutional newspaper. No, not my workplace. Yeah.
You type that in on eBay and see what happens.
Yeah. You had a question.
Oh,
I don't know. I'm sorry.
So I'm really interested in women's experience with pornography. So I loved your point that your comment that you had found your brother's materials.
Right.
So I wondered if you have.
It was around your band. Was it something around your band?
Yeah.
Yeah. For you. I wondered if you have any sense of how extremely gender limited people's access to pornography at this time.
Yeah.
Was it complete limit based on gender? Do you think that women did have some access commercially?
Yep. In this particular case, my whole sort of interest was because the Army passed this law, right? So I'm probably ill-equipped to answer that question because I started with the question of the Army, and it was all men that they were worried about accessing it.
Yeah.
But there are, in answer to your question, there are these short-lived, kind of somewhat sort of lurid newspapers that are public, a couple of newspaper collections, something called Venus Miscellany, for instance, which was a short-run kind of erotic magazine kind of thing that was published in New York in the mid-19th century that was really interesting to me from, in particular as my own interest in women and finding out more about women, because they ran columns in which women would write in talking about their sexual fantasies. And so that was really interesting to me. Of course, it's totally impossible to tell if these are real women, right? Or if this is just the editor, right? Like Fanny Hill, right? Like that's probably. I would be really skeptical about. It's obviously written for male consumption.
Right. And what woman would describe herself that way? Opening the book.
Right. Not in any period would any of that be the way they would. I've never seen a Victorian woman describe herself in that way, and even though this is earlier, I can't imagine. So it's really. So I'm always really suspicious of any of this stuff that, especially these letters. I was so excited to see this column, where women would write in and talk about things that they imagined doing with them, their husbands or their boyfriends or whatever. I thought, oh my God, this is such a great find. And I thought, well, wait a minute, the audience for this is probably all men, so is this really women? Right? And the same thing with these letters too, these fake letters written back and forth between women. Are they really women? So it's not really answering your question. But I think there's certainly there's a whole project to be done on the people who pose for these erotic carte de visite. Because there can be some paperwork there, because you sometimes get a studio or a name of a photographer or something like that, and sometimes. And these women were also often described as actresses or actors. And whether that means because the theater is also sort of always painted with this kind of tawdry, reputation too. Whether or not these women also performed on stage, I don't know. But but this was business and work for them, and that's something that somebody who's better at finding this stuff needs to follow up on those women who were making a living, right, selling these carte de visite or posing for these carte de visite. So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giesberg.